On today's 7th Circle Gaming, we analyze the October 30th update of Grand Tactician, The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. We're going to start off, as we always do, with a bit of full disclosure, and as always, you can pause the video now and read through all of these, or if you prefer not to, let's move right on to the screenshots. And the first screenshot is one that I know that we've shared with you before, but we do want to highlight two items in particular. In all of our previous analyses of the game, we've stuck to the default selected policies, those items that are highlighted in the big red box, but on this particular analysis, we have done a bit more experimentation. And what we found from that is that players that are particularly interested in obtaining a particular outcome, like a European intervention, are going to want to pay close attention to which policies that they select. Players that are also that are interested in a particular outcome should also pay close attention to which starting conditions they select. The maximum opportunity of a particular outcome is, from what we found, is in selecting the earliest possible starting conditions. That said, that is highly subjective, but let's move on anyway to our next screenshot. Now, this is a menu that the game refers to as the policies screen. However, in other games, this would be called a technology tree or a research tree. One of the things that we want to highlight on this particular screen, or on this particular menu, is that there are some policies that can be taken both as a starting policy and as a researchable policy. And the game doesn't necessarily make clear if taking that as a starting policy will overrule the researchable policy, or does the player really need to research the policy again, even though they've taken it as a starting policy. It's confusing. Now, believe me, it's been confusing more and more as we spent more time with Grand Tactician. Moving right along to one of the other major parts of the game, and another screenshot. This is the finance screen. Now, obviously, finances are going to be important to the health of any country, but what we want to draw your attention to in particular is on this menu, the subsidies screen, or the subsidies menu, which is on the right hand side of the screen. Something that the tutorial could be more effective about is explaining what the effect of manipulating those subsidies is in all of our evaluation sessions. We really haven't noticed any obvious effects of that. So then, moving on to our next screenshot, we do have one more after this, and this is the campaign map. It's where players are going to be spending the majority of their time with what seems to be, in all of our time spent with the game, a very high-level grand strategy game, and one that seems to be very focused on military movements, not necessarily the nuts and bolts of managing a country. That said, on this menu is where players are going to be spending the majority of their time. It's also where players have the option of building new structures, building new ships, or recruiting new armies. One more thing that we would draw your attention to on this particular screen is the item that's it's in right front and center on the screen, and that is that there are some grammatical and some spelling errors in this particular game. Not necessarily a game-breaking issue, but something that players want to be aware of. Now then, moving right along to our last screenshot, and that is of the battle screen. should players choose to engage with this. Now, this is actually from one of the historical battles that players can choose to refight. And the reason we include this is just to highlight a couple of items. Among them is the fact that the game remains a very attractive looking and sounding product. We would also mention here that at this particular screen that there are some issues with sensitivity in the mouse, and something that players are going to want to investigate the settings menu to address. With that, though, let's move right along to our first proper chapter. Immersion. We have not noticed any significant changes from previous versions, and so the game retains its 14 out of 15, which brings us right along to difficulty. Here the game has earned a 6 out of 15. The key bindings remain unusual, but players that are familiar with other grand strategy games and real-time strategy games should be able to adapt to them rather quickly. The tutorial is highly suggested, as it always has been for this particular game. The user interface hasn't had any major changes over any of the versions, and there are some quality of life features missing from the game. One of the couple of them that we've noted is on some menus the text, the font size is rather in the eye strain region rather than the easy to read. The mouse detection area and the confirmation timeout has been something of a persistent issue with the game, going from poor to reasonable to, well, what it currently is. But what that really is touching on is that players are going to want to investigate the settings menu, and in particular possibly looking for any kind of mouse sensitivity adjustment and reducing that. With that little aside out of the way, let's move on to lasting appeal. Here the game has earned a 5 out of 15. Some of that is going to come from its lack of downloadable content and mod support. In one of the previous updates, the game added the ability to use player-provided photos and create themselves as generals in the conflict. This will appeal to some players, but for players that are particularly interested in the history of the time period, we can't see that necessarily being used, as players are going to prefer to engage with the generals and colonels and admirals that they've read about. It is entirely possible, though, to play through the game in what we are terming a themed or challenge run, specializing in a particular policy family like industrial, military, agricultural, or diplomatic, or players can attempt to use as much of their secure a particular outcome, like European intervention, Mexican assistance, or just a general alternate history theory that the player might have. Some players might find the economic and diplomatic systems of the game limited compared to other grand strategy games. Others are going to find it challenging or confusing. Now, what we're trying to say there is that it does seem like Grand Tactician is much more interested in those military movements and naval movements than it is in the other things, which, although they will impact the military tactic or strategy, it's the military strategy that the game is really much more interested in. There are, however, two modes of engaging with the software, these being the campaign and the historical battles mode. There are, of course, as we might expect, two factions to select from, with multiple possible starting conditions, that being those starting policies that we talked about earlier. Now then, with that out of the way, we do want to move on and come to our overall score so that we don't have this video going on for hours and hours and hours. So, the game has earned an 8.33 out of 15. It remains not an easy game that can be played mindlessly. It is still an attractive looking game with attractive sound as well. Players that are particularly interested in obtaining a particular outcome, like the previously mentioned European intervention or something like that, would be well advised to look around online for walkthroughs or guides on how to do that. From all of our evaluation sessions, it does seem like the alternate history possibilities are somewhat limited, however. The conflict will always start on the historical date. It's not possible to delay the start of the conflict to 1862 or 1863. Players also cannot, through any sort of machinations, avoid the conflict from starting. From this, we could derive that it is entirely possible that there is an optimal build and research and recruiting order that players are going to want to pursue. And now that is obviously highly subjective. And we're going to actually continue on that highly subjective line of thinking with, although the auto-resolve feature of the game is particularly reasonable and doesn't have poor outcomes, if the players engage with the battle system, it does seem that these exhibit what we around here term the whack-a-mole syndrome. What that refers to is that, for example, a player unit of 10 troops engages an opposition unit of 10 troops. The opposition unit will not surrender completely until it has reached absolutely 0 units or 0 troops available. If the opposition unit has even 1 troop in it, it will fall back, say 5 feet, and then begin attacking again. Hence the analogy to whack-a-mole. It does seem that, and I know we've said this before, but the maximum opportunity for changing the outcome of the conflict is going to be in that spring 1861 starting condition only. Further on than that, players are going to get almost siloed into the actual history, leading to the expected end. And speaking of ends, that is the end of this particular video. Please put any disagreements, comments, concerns in the comments section below. Do the other YouTube things if you did get something out of this. And from 7th Circle Gaming,